Alright, what's going on, guys? Since the Elden Ring DLC gameplay trailer dropped, we've been going wild in speculation about the story and the lore elements that will most likely be showing up, but today we need to get a little more grounded, both figuratively and literally, because one thing the DLC gameplay trailer showed that we haven't covered a lot are all the new areas that we'll be exploring, ranging from open fields to legacy dungeons and everything in between. So let's go through the trailer bit by bit and break down every new area we can see, attempt to locate it on the map, and approach all of this from a new angle. Starting off with the opening shot of the Land of Shadow, we have the first open field, a large expansive open world area which is in this biome of a wheat field with all these phantom gravestones about. This field was our first look at the DLC and concept art, and if there was any doubt that this was an open field, recently Bandai Namco unveiled a bit of the collector's edition of the DLC, and on the first page of the art book, it is labeled as a field. Now the thing to keep in mind about this is that it has been stated that the DLC is not going to follow, at least as directly, the same formula that the base game did in separating all the areas by field and dungeon. Areas will flow together much more seamlessly, which makes it harder, at least on our end, to pinpoint exactly where everything is going to be placed. With that being said though, we pretty much know exactly where this is, based on this very wide shot of the player approaching this cliff face and overlooking the Land of Shadow. And this shot right here will be our reference point. But now let's move on to another biome that can be easily placed. One thing you'll notice about various scenes throughout the trailer is that the skybox looks very different, although we can recognize many of the same landmarks as it changes from scene to scene, which is something that happens in the base game. As you cross different area borders, the skybox will change, which is also a very valuable tool in mapping out these areas, as we can reference the scenes that contain the same skybox. So keeping with the one we can see in the first open field, we have a few other scenes that take place in this same area. Firstly, this shot with this knight NPC, even though it is at nighttime, we can see that he is standing in the same field based on the wheatgrass and the phantom gravestones. He's just a little bit further down in the valley. This fight with the Wicker Man also takes place in the same field, as we still see the grass and gravestones, and the skybox remains the same. We also have a landmark to pinpoint almost exactly where this is, with this ruined castle structure in the background that can be seen here going back to our image. And it's also possible that this very low resolution fireball that we can see if we look very closely is the Wicker Man, but the angle there doesn't match up, so there may be a few of them, but I'm not entirely sure. But on the right side, we can see these columns and this very jagged rock, which are points of interest in both of these NPC shots, the second of which can be seen sitting in this same field. But taking just a second to look at this wide shot, you can count about 14 big structures, all of which could be their own miniature levels, which makes you realize just how big this area is going to be, and how much more is hidden from sight by these large cliffs. But for as epic of an experience as Elden Ring is, it's important to make sure that you can get the most out of it by playing on hardware that optimizes your experience, which is why we're partnering with Apex Gaming PCs to bring you just that. Top of the line pre-built gaming PCs, specially made just in time for Elden Ring DLC. There are 3 tiers of PCs available, with the top 2 including a 40 series GPU, which will more than be able to capture all those beautiful vistas. So use my link down in the description and pinned comment to get your new gaming PC today. But now let's get back into it. Keeping with the same skybox, in this shot here we see this cliff with these big roots exposed. Comparing that to our image, we'll know that this is on the left, meaning that in this shot the character is further down into the valley than they are in the panoramic. But in the background of this shot, we see a pretty massive level. Later on in the trailer, we can confirm that what we're seeing here are the upper reaches of this legacy dungeon, which appears to be breaking and floating off into the sky, much like Farum Azula. And if we zoom in very closely, we can get a look at some of the architectural motifs, which can then be used to reference this shot here. And when we look at this bridge, we see that same legacy dungeon off to the right, and the little plateau at the other side of the bridge is the same cliff face we mentioned earlier. So that means this bridge is probably the one we can see right there, if not another one slightly closer to that cliff face. But going back to this legacy dungeon, a lot of this architecture lines up with what we can see in the Lion Dance boss fight, specifically this curved wall right here and the style of roof slightly above, which we can see here and here, as well as the same kind of columns and images of important figures like what we see at the beginning, as well as all the reliefs and the roots hanging down. I'd wager the Lion Dance boss fight takes place right in the middle of this area. The telling part being that large staircase we see in the background and the shadow Erdtree being on the right. I think it's this one right here, and the Lion Dance fight is somewhere in the middle, like right here, behind this wall. But that's just a guess for now. And this shot also falls in that location likely, again because of those same architectural motifs and the lion statues, but it is hard to say for certain. But from this shot we can lead into another area based on these green trees off to the right, which we can see behind the player that throws this bomb alongside this big pantheon looking structure, which back in our reference image can be seen off to the left and looks big enough to be its own open field. Now throughout the entire trailer, the only shot I found that could potentially be in this area is this one, given that it is heavily wooded and very green, but it is pretty hard to tell. But close nearby, if that is the case, is this waterfall that we can see behind this large castle looking structure with some belfries off behind it, which could be the area we fight this hippo rhino thing. However, we see multiple waterfalls in this shot, neither of which look exactly like the one we see in the panoramic, but at the very end of this clip, we can see this sharp looking rock on the right side, which does look to be the same one we talked about earlier in this shot of the NPC and in the background of the Wicker Man fight. So I think it's safe to assume that other waterfalls run through these crevices we can see, which places that rhino fight somewhere in one of these valleys. But now let's change skyboxes, and we have a few scenes that play on this blue color seen in this image of the Carian NPC. Now we've talked before how the room that this NPC is in is virtually identical to the Church of the Cuckoo, which is the entrance area of Raya Lucaria, which can give us somewhat of an idea of where this might be, going back to our panoramic shot. Now given that we have an entire skybox change here, I don't think it's anywhere in the middle, even though we can see a Carian belfry, but to the right we do have a cathedral, which looks to be identical to the Cathedral of Manus Celeste. Now later on in the trailer we get this scene, and the player fighting this red dancer in a blue flower field under a bluish gray skybox, and I don't think it's just nighttime. Now glowing blue flowers in the base game of Elden Ring are symbolic of Carian architecture. We find them outside the Carian study hall, throughout the Moonlight Altar, and around the Carian rises around the map. So I think it's safe to say that this scene takes place in a similar area as the Carian NPC. Now, one thing you'll notice in this shot is that the camera pans down when it gets to the middle. I think this is probably done on purpose not to show the shadow tree, to make it a harder time to locate this, but given the wrecked ships here, and the fact that there's just a void off behind the characters, and we can't see the shadow tree anywhere else, that's likely the case, which puts this on the right side of our panoramic, along the coast. And I do think this leech monster is in that same area as well, given the emphasis on the moon, the fact that we can't see anything off in the distance, and that the player character is wearing the Carian night set. I think it's pretty clear what they're trying to communicate, although it is possible that this takes place somewhere else and it's just nighttime, but I do think the color, the armor, and the shot are all deliberate. So now let's talk about the big spot we can see right there in the middle, the main legacy dungeon that the DLC is advertising. Now from the front, we can see what looks to be two towers situated within some large castle walls, connected to that forest biome that we discussed by a bridge, and then that giant inverted arch behind it that's always seen throughout the trailer, centered under that falling sap of the shadow tree. Now we get a few distant shots of it throughout the trailer, and we can see, at least in this one here, that there does appear to be a good amount of distance between the towers and the arch, but not enough to tell if they're part of the same structure or not. Now, something interesting you might have missed a while back, at the end of the trailer in the Collector's Edition showcase, we do get a bit of concept art about this legacy dungeon, which does seem to indicate that the arch is part of it, although the entire structure looks a bit different in the actual trailer. We also have this image along one of the bridges leading to it, and I do think this could indicate what the skybox change is going to be when reaching this legacy dungeon, with this very fiery sunset look. And then the final concept art that we have seems to be inside the walls, with what looks to be a boss arena and a giant statue of Queen Marika that happens to be missing its head. And the skybox does look the same as it did in the shot of the bridge. Now, as far as it looks to me, we're unable to tell if any of these shots take place in that castle, although I do think there's a good chance that this shot of the player fighting this knight could take place in that arena we saw in the concept art. They do look at least a little bit alike, but I don't think we have enough evidence to say for sure that's what it is. And if I had to put money on it, I would say this main castle legacy dungeon is probably where we'll fight Mesmer, but that is purely a guess. Now we do get a look at a handful of underground locations, which obviously we can't place on a map, but here in this fight with this skeletal figure on this melting horse takes place in a cave with lots of Trina's lilies around the area and a purple hue, which may be the same area that we see in the shot of an NPC early on in the trailer, who's fallen asleep among a bunch of Trina's lilies. We also see this shot inside what looks to be a cave of all these hanging pots, and the blue hue of the area may place it in the Carian biome, but as of right now we don't have enough evidence to say for sure. Now this shot of this Archimedes screw pumping lava is very reminiscent of the heroes' graves in the base game, and I think there's a good chance that it could be a dungeon like that, but there is also a possibility that this is inside a legacy dungeon. We'll ultimately just have to wait and see on that. Another possible legacy dungeon is the swamp, which we only get one shot of, and due to the obscurity of the trees, we can't say for sure where it is on the map. Although, the roots on the side do look like the ones we talked about earlier on the little plateau, but I think the most we can say about this swamp is that it's going to be like the waterfalls in one of the many crevices we can see between the different areas. But besides that, this other shot later on in the trailer looks like it could be in the swamp as well, given the pretty hazy fog and that yellowish green color of the grass. And the final discernibly unique area we can see in the trailer is this purple hazy town, with these incense burners releasing a smoke into the air. Now, one unique aspect about what we can see here are these tarps covering the buildings. And if we go back to the opening shot of the trailer of our panoramic view, we do see other similarly covered buildings. Although the little area we see there at the bottom appears to be much smaller than what it looks like in this action sequence. So while I don't think they're the same area, I do think it's possible there are multiple of these little towns that have been covered in a similar fashion. And based on the size of what we can see here in this clip, it looks like this could be another entire legacy dungeon. But those are all of the unique areas we can see in the trailer. I'm sure we're barely scratching the surface with what we got shown. If we were to break it down pixel by pixel, there are so many minor structures around this area that it's all going to be so densely packed that it may feel even bigger than it actually is. But based on all of that, let me know down in the comments what area that we have seen are you most excited to explore. We've only got 2 more months to wait, and I know that can't come soon enough. But if you're excited about these new areas, let me know by leaving a like on the video and subscribe if you're new around here. Also go check out Apex Gaming PCs and get your rig ready for the DLC. And with all that, I will catch you in the next one.